Hello and welcome back to Everything is Ideology. I'm your host, Lee Kaplan. Universities often present themselves as neutral institutions devoted to the pursuit of knowledge. But what counts as knowledge? Who decides which ways of learning are legitimate? And why have certain forms of education, particularly those rooted in community, oral tradition, and collective practice, so often been excluded from the academy in favor of European models of expertise? Today we're exploring these questions through the lens of Caribbean music in higher education. I'm joined by ethnomusicologist Andrew Martin to discuss his article, Traditional Methods, the UWI Campus as Caribbean Music Laboratory. Together, we discuss the history of steel pan and its transformation from a grassroots music and community tradition into an object of academic study. We examine how colonialism continues to shape what universities recognize as legitimate knowledge, why experiential and community based learning often remains subordinated to lecture based instruction, and how practices such as liming challenge dominant assumptions about productivity, education, social life, and temporality. We also explore the relationship between universities and the communities that surround them, asking how music can serve as a bridge between formal and informal education rather than remaining confined to the classroom. Along the way, we discuss oral traditions and alternative systems of musical notation and pedagogy, the politics of curriculum design, and the influence of tourism on Caribbean musical cultures, and the surprising role American universities played in legitimizing steel pan studies before many Caribbean institutions did. Legitimizing. If you like what we do here, please become a patron at patreon.com/everythingisideology or give a one-time or multiple-time donation at buymeacoffee.com/everythingisideology. Today, I'm joined by Andrew Martin, who holds a PhD in musicology and ethnomusicology, an MA in musicology, and an MM in percussion performance. He completed his undergraduate studies at the University of Wisconsin Green Bay. His scholarship has appeared in numerous publications, including American Music, Pan Podium, the Journal of the British Steel Band Society, and the Journal of New York Folklore. He has also contributed to the Grove Dictionary of American Music and authored the book Steel Pan Ambassadors, the U.S. Navy Steel Band, 1957 to 1999. His research focuses on steel pan traditions, Caribbean music, ethnomusicology, and the cultural histories of performance and education. So, the performance and histories of education is something that we're going to be talking about specifically because that's the article we're going to be focusing on today. So would you mind telling us a little bit about this project and some of the things you're trying to solve or the history you were trying to lay out throughout it?
Sure. Well, and the piece that you're talking about was one that I wrote for the CLR James Journal, and it talks about um, really looking at getting and setting curriculum in contemporary university systems, whether they be in the Caribbean or in the United States. And specifically, I was talking about the University of the West Indies, which in 2020 opened an entirely full new campus in the island of Antigua in the Caribbean. So, for those of your listeners who are not, of course, totally familiar with the University of the West Indies, they have several campuses. It's one university system that has several regional campuses. So there is a campus in Mona, which is Jamaica. That Mona is a suburb of Kingston, if you will. There's one in Barbados, which is Cave Hill, which is again, suburb of the capital, and then St. Augustine, which is a suburb of Port of Spain, Trinidad. That's in the Twin Island nation of Trinidad and Tobago, and then they had what's called the open system, which really was very an online education system before. We had really robust online education systems worldwide prior to the pandemic in 2020. And so it makes perfect sense. It's hard to travel to go to university. So if you can do something remotely, that's what there was. And so there were remote campuses throughout. But in 2020, the UE system opened a new campus in Antigua, and there was a real opportunity for what this could look like. Now, previously to this, I mean, well, first of all, it's a very exciting thing to just open a new university anywhere, right? We don't really hear about this happening. Certainly in the United States, there's the University of Minnesota is just not opening another campus anytime soon, nor is basically every other state university system, given the taxing that's going on, of the university, I guess, uh, systems all throughout the country and so on. But the UWI has with their three main campuses in the Caribbean, they've set aside certain areas for certain subjects. So, the law school, for instance, is in the Mona campus, and then the um, the music school is in the St. Augustine campus in Trinidad, and so on and so forth. So that every campus has its own identity. And you can have obviously your main subjects, just like any hyphen school, as we would say, maybe in the United States. The University uh, of Wisconsin, Eau Claire is going to they're going to have sociology and all those sorts of things. But the music school is was in St. Augustine, and the campus in Mona, or sorry, excuse me, the campus in Antigua had this opportunity to really sort of reinvent itself as it was a new system, right? And so, what was going to be their focus? And they've looked a lot at finance and cyber systems and that sort of stuff because the upfront costs of investing in those were seen as a good investment, as well as the economy in Antigua, Barbuda, and the Five Islands, which is Montserrat and so on, Saint Kitts. It is more dealing with tourism and banking and computers and cyber. So I made some recommendations based off of how to not completely forget that they are a campus in the Caribbean. And what I mean by that is what we often see in places, especially in the Caribbean, but this is true of other areas in the world, let alone the United States or the Caribbean, where people have to leave for education. And so I want to think about this broadly, just as if like you were in a small town in the middle of Montana or a small town in the middle of, insert place, right? You have a brain drain that happens where you have the students, they grow up, they become that sort of 16, 17, 18 years old. They want to go off to university. Previously to this experience in Antigua, they just had to lead the country. And so they're leaving for anywhere between 4 and 8 to 10 years, depending on what their university education is, if they're seeking professional training, if they're just only seeking undergrad. And only a certain percentage of them would come back. And so you have this issue with people leaving, coming back, and so on. Um, but with this idea, then in this new campus, we have this ability to say, okay, well, we have their students, and they want to stay home, and they're specifically choosing to go to university here in Antigua. Um, but that also gives us an opportunity to not necessarily privilege exclusively the Western Academy's way of teaching and learning. And so one of the things that I was arguing about this piece was UE Five Islands needs to start a steel band. And a lot of my work, my ethnomusicological work, revolves around Caribbean music. And specifically, I like to look at steel band, calypso music, tourism, soca, Caribbean music and genres and instruments, but specifically the steel band, and how it's developed outside of the Caribbean, how it is utilized in schools throughout the United States, Canada, UK, that sort of thing. Um, and how we're approaching this idea of a multicultural music that balances a lot of different traditions. Well, in Antigua Barbuda, they've had steel pan since 1945. It is a traditional music. Okay. And so one of the things that I was arguing about in my piece was, or suggesting was the benefits of having something like a steel band within the university structure. And one of the things that I was highlighting was the interconnected nature of steel bands within the Caribbean education and community system. And to give a little bit of background, um, steel band was invented in Trinidad and Tobago in the late 1930s and early 1940s. But post World War II, you have you have lots of movement of peoples throughout the Caribbean for work, right? So it's not like, yes, these are islands and they have boundaries, but people travel, right? So they go to work. In various industries, and maybe they work in the bauxite industry in Jamaica, or maybe they are working in the tourist industries, or they're seasonally working for crop harvest and so on. But there's people just they travel for work there just like they travel anywhere else. And so the steel band quickly spread throughout all these other islands, and so you have steel band scenes developing all over. There's steel bands in St. Lucia and St. Vincent, and of course everywhere else. So um but in the Caribbean, these steel bands are important community identity pieces, and they are as important in 2026 as maybe like these VFW slash foreign legions posts were in the United States in the 1920s and the 1930s, these veterans of foreign wars and so on, where you have these communities wherever they are, they gather together, people are banding together, and there's a band, there's a meeting area, there's a volunteer group, there's a whatever, a sports league or whatever. And we had those very tight knit community activities. Well, steel band is definitely one of them, and one of the reasons why it's so important for the university is that it has this Pan Caribbean identity piece to it, where you're not necessarily taking steel band as a university course that gives you credit. There's just a steel band there. You participate in this steel band. Now, the steel band is going to, yes, perform a little bit on campus and around campus, but this steel band will also then work with a local community group, and they might work with a local church, and they might work with a local school. And so there's a really circular integration between that. So then you have students who are studying, let's just say, a general social work, okay? And or let's say finance, or because it doesn't have to be something that is a social service. Let's say they're studying finance, they're playing in the steel band, they're going out, they're seeing how finance and elements of the financial system directly impact various uh, stratas of the social system in ways that they never saw before. And so there's this really unique integration of opportunity and culture, and in my case, artistic musicality, that are all interconnected, right? And these steel bands are spontaneous in the sense that it's amateur music making. David Byrne, in his book How Music Works, makes this real argument about, and this is a paraphrase, but he makes an argument around this idea of amateur music making versus music consumption. And we in this sort of academy like to talk about this idea of, Edison invents the music recording, and then we have radio, and that sometime in that sort of like 1920s, 30s, 40s nebulous range, Americans go from being music producers, active music making, to just music consumers. We just listen, right? We want these records. We want to listen to this music, and this idea of amateur music making takes on less of an importance. And Byrne talks about this, and he says, people in and this book he wrote maybe 15 years ago, but he really foreshadows, say, 2026, in which yeah, you don't need to write a song anymore. Just have AI do it for you, right? Like that's what the sort of industrial consumption complex wants you to do. Versus Byrne is talking about this idea of, sometimes it's just good to get with your friends and make music, even if you're bad. It's not about like becoming a professional. It's just about playing and having that experience and being together with one another. And there is this term in the Caribbean, it's called liming. And liming basically means we are going to get together and do nothing. And with each other, and there is no expectation of doing something. As in, and I mean something, I mean like literally, it's just we're going to hang around on the couch, we're going to sit outside on the porch, we're going to meet at the community center or the pan yard or the bar, and less so the bar, but still we're going to go there and we're just going to hang out and we're just going to kind of be around each other, right? Because it's not necessarily, everything is not necessarily goal oriented and activity based, right? And so this steel band provides this opportunity for people to do amateur music making in addition to providing these other opportunities for social interaction. And so this is a long standing African cultural tradition that precedes the Middle Transfer and enslavement, and is very common throughout West African histories of all of the peoples who were eventually enslaved and brought to the Caribbean. A very bulk of the formerly enslaved in Antigua, for example, come from the Nigeria, Ghana area. Same for Jamaica, but enslaved folks came from all over Africa, were brought to, of course, to the Caribbean. This isn't news to anybody. And so this tradition of social engagement and of community making, regardless of end goal, right? It's not necessarily goal oriented. It's just experiential, and it's togetherness is really quite important. Now, of course, this is not reserved to West African cultures. I mean, there are plenty of cultures in the world that do this, but in the academy, we often see the reverse of this. We see this reliance on Western European teaching methods, reading and writing and lecture deliveries and so on and so forth. And one of the things that I was arguing in my article for the CLR James Journal was we should embrace the importance of these non-Western ways of learning and being. And steel pan is exactly one of these ways that we should be doing this. And we should be embracing this in a way that is going to be um, true to the UE ethos of a global education. Because yes, these people that are being trained at UE need to go off and work with people in the rest of the global Western society, whatever, but they are also Caribbean folks. And there is not just value, there is equal value in their ways of learning and their methodologies. And so I was really encouraging UE to say, this is a time in which you can embrace these things. This is a time in which you can hold them up on par with the typical learning ethos of the Western academy.
Yeah, that was great. Thanks for touching on so many different points. I think a lot of it was really interesting was this relationship. There's a tension and a relationship between kind of like the reservations that the university might have from like residual colonial sort of pedagogies and kind of the more Pan-Africanist or non-Western forms of education and listening and experiential music making and practice that happen. For instance, like, I can't imagine a class where you sort of lime, you know? Imagine,
Mhm.
like, a 2.5-hour class of just liming. That would be wonderful. I would love to teach that class. In
Right,
fact, I
right,
think
right,
everybody would probably be a teacher in that class.
right.
Because learning how to do nothing is actually quite a profound experience. Uh
Absolutely, absolutely. But I think it also reaches back to this idea of we always say things to our students or our children or whatever, like, it's these people, I remember hanging out with so and so, and it's these soft moments of that university or that high school or that educational experience, right? That are really important. And I don't want I wanted to just encourage you to not lose sight of creating those opportunities in a way. And yes, but otherwise, the idea of learning to lime is even so. I mean, I this is 25 years I've been working, going down into the Caribbean and doing my field work, and because I'm not from there, I'm an interloper. Definitely, I'm an outsider, but. Um, Even sometimes now, I'm like, are we gonna get going here? Like, are we gonna do this? But you have to slow down, and you have to just. I mean, people are living in that moment, and they're embracing the importance of that moment, right? And I think it's culturally, it's a way of looking at saying this moment or this time or uh, these people and these experiences are important, and I think that's really valuable.
Yeah, I guess there's definitely an article to be written there. There probably is on Lime time, something like this. Like, different forms of time and the perception of time, for like capitalistic time versus like colonial time versus like free time, but free time becoming like a liberatory framework or something like this.
Right, right. Mm.
I'm kind of curious about the direct relationship between the university and the music making programs because while they do have you outline sort of this like cultural component and whatnot, it does have this kind of contentious and maybe perhaps nebulous relationship at time with the university. Like, how do these kind of cultural aspects, music making, and these sorts of different cultural practices become embedded within something like, or potentially embedded within the framework of the institution? And what are some of the tensions that come across because of this coalescence?
Yeah, absolutely. So, firstly, I will say that the only campus, well, first certainly in UE, the St. Augustine campus has like a uh, what someone would describe me as a proper music school. Okay, so they have, you would go through your music theory and oral skills, and you would do your music history and all that kind of studies. And if you want to do violin or trombone or whatever, the sort of Western standard instruments, like you're going to do it at a conservatory style proper music school. That's in St. Augustine. The other campuses have music activities, and they might. The the concept like in the US of your general ed where you take like jazz history or rock history or music appreciation, that doesn't really exist as much in the UE curriculum. So it's kind of like you want to study music, you go down there, okay? But music definitely is an important activity in these other campuses, certainly in the Mona campus as well. And the friction comes from a couple of different areas. The first area is when steel pan was invented in the late 1930s and early 1940s as an instrument, it came about from, it's a long process that goes back even another 100 years to this thing called Canis Brulee, which is um, basically a carnival time celebration of, and during that time, recently, um, freed is not the right word, but in 1834, Britain officially ended their slave practice, and so you have all these people that were formerly enslaved that were now like freed people of color, as the term we would use in the United States, and so they wanted to follow, kind of merge some of their polytheistic African cultural traditions with the French and Spanish Catholic version, carnival traditions leading up to Ash Wednesday of the liturgical church calendar, the Catholic Church calendar, Roman Catholic, that is. Um, but if we, so there's a long process, and we won't need to necessarily get into it now. But what we need to know is that in the people that really started making these instruments out of steel pans, out of they were using dustbins, which are trash cans and things like that, and then they eventually settled on 55-gallon oil drums, which were um, made access. Trinidad Tobago is the southernmost Caribbean island, and it sits on the same oil field as Venezuela. And so there's been natural gas and oil refining there for over 100 and some years. And the people that were making these instruments were gangs. These were unemployed young men. These were ruffians. These were they called them bad johns. And so the first 20 to 25 years of Steel Pan's existence was, rival gang stuff. And I mean, just as, you had all of the gang affiliations with hip hop in the late 80s into the early 90s and so on. I mean, you had like individual steel bands would represent neighborhoods, and they were not necessarily like gangs that were like, we're going to go out and murder people and sell drugs. They were just like, this was this group of all the young men from this one neighborhood. They were all unemployed, poor, and, stuff happens when you're young and you've got energy and you've got angst and so on, right? And so there became this negative stigma that was attached to the instrument from the get-go. And also, um, to circle back even further to your original point, colonialism is just the impacts of colonialism. I think are really hard to understand on it, like the visceral effects of those on a daily basis for people who have, say, perhaps not grown up in a very colonial system. And so, the the colonial overlords, I guess, if you will, the colonial leaders of Trinidad and Tobago, they really if it wasn't Bach, Beethoven, or Brahms, it was not worth your time. And so, since Steel Pan was playing calypso and some of these other pop music song forms during the 1940s and 50s, it had this negative stigma. Well, just like jazz has not a negative stigma, but jazz, if we look at jazz history, right, we're always dealing with this, like, it's, yeah, okay, it's good music, but it's not like art, right? And then, as I'm saying this from like that sort of haughty academies look at jazz, and then it takes 100 or so years, and now people will say that, oh yeah, well, insert famous jazz name of somebody who's contemporary. I don't know. Like, well, I mean, Wynton Marsalis isn't. I mean, I guess he's still alive. He's not as connected as he certainly used. Esperanza Spalding, for example. People will look at Esperanza Spalding and be like, she's a genius. Like, she's a legit world class bona fide genius, right? And no one has any problem with that, right? So how do we get from beginning to the end, right? There's a long process, and the steel band has certainly undergone that same trajectory. And so when we are at a place like UE Mona, you are going to have attitudes where people are going to say, well, the steel band is just, that's fine, but that's not for the academy. The academy is for math and science and botany and, the law and so on. It's for studies of quote, serious, real things. This music is this is for fun. This is something else. And so part of that friction that comes from this is there are still colonial attitudes, and these aren't colonial attitudes that are like perpetuated by white folks, mind you, right? Because Jamaica's been independent since like 1960 or 61, I can't remember exactly. It's just this idea that like these attitudes are long serving, right? And so part of the friction then, and part of my argument in embracing this and encouraging the folks in Antigua to do the same is people will see this in the community. They will see this at their church. They will see this steel band, that is, and they will see it at carnival time. But yet they're not necessarily then embracing it as well, this is something that is worth the study in the academic area, right? And so there is just always this like eternal friction between the two. Now, it's easy for me as an outsider to say like, well, I mean, are you kidding? There's just like no difference, right? Like this is a very valuable subject to study, and here's 35,000 reasons why. But um, that tension is still a definite visceral colonial tension, and it has to do with those attitudes. And so there's one other issue that is coming into this, and it has to do with this idea of like that sociological idea of the simulacra, this idea that in the tourist industry, steel pan, calypso, soca, this music has been adopted by the tourist industry, and it's been desensitized and it's been utilized for a commercial purpose. So there are a whole nother faction of people that'd say, well, why would we study steel pan, or why would we have the steel band in the university system? That's just for tourists at Sandals or at the resort. That's not for the academic study. And it is because of this co-option that has happened since the Calypso craze, which runs roughly 1955 to 1957. It's the release of Harry Belafonte's Calypso album, which is in 1955, I believe, to roughly around 1957, 58, where Calypso was like the pop music in the United States. And there's these, if you looked at like the trade magazines and things, like Life magazine had this article that said, "Will Calypso dethrone Elvis?" Right? Like it was a thing. I mean, and Harry Belafonte's Calypso record was the first million-selling LP, for long play record. It's the first million-selling LP, right? And I mean, and that's in the mid-1950s. It's a massive hit, right? So there is this friction because this traditional music has been co-opted and utilized by yet another Western industry, that there is still some friction about it in its place in the academy. And so what we're seeing and what I'm observing is there's still a lingering friction, questions, whatever, however you want to describe it, between people separating the touristy style of this Caribbean music with the traditional and living, breathing, changing tradition of these musics, which are still there and are still happening and are still just as vibrant as they ever were. But because, of, again, that, and this is even more so in a place like Antigua Barbuda, where tourism is such a huge part of their economy, right? It's less so in other islands. Like Trinidad and Tobago, frankly, does not have a huge tourist industry. But Jamaica, I was just returned from Jamaica, and I was just astonished at the North Shore of Jamaica from Montego Bay all the way to Ocho Rio. It's just staggering the amount of tourist development that's happening. And I'm not saying that as a bad thing. I'm just saying like the importance of the tourist industry to this country's economy is just, I don't think we can downplay that significance. And because of that, then we're seeing a residual impact in other areas such as the academy here.
Yeah, of course. And music always plays such a role in creating the idea of a place and of a space as well. Like it's hard to just sort of imagine Jamaica without also just somehow in your mind thinking of the sounds of kind of Bob Marley or reggae or like,
Yeah.
the and beat of stuff or something like this. So it's really hard to separate because the music also creates the place, and the place also creates the music. But there is a living, robust tradition that you do speak of, sort of with these steel pan bands that happen in different places in different ways. But there's something interesting happening here because uh, jazz became taken seriously in many cases because by like hegemonic institutions and bastions of whiteness, because of Europe sanctioning the music as artistic, as worthy of study, or something like this. But here, there's a different sort of dynamic happening where the university was embarrassed, you write, by Northern Illinois University's program happening. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that entire dynamic, the relationship with it, and then what universities in turn responded with or how.
Sure. So, um, in the 90s, the early 90s, the University of the West Indies, the music school, which the College of Creative and Performing Arts, which is in St. Augustine in Trinidad, um, they were they were toying with the idea of adding the steel pan as a curriculum-based instrument. So you could do as your primary instrument of study. And for those of your listeners who aren't aware, if you go to music school anywhere in the world, you typically are going to enter with an area of study where, whether that be you're a pianist, you're a saxophonist, you're a violinist, or whatever, right? Your voice, like whatever your instrument, or if you're a composer, then you would do composition and so on. So you have these various elements. And so the UE St. Augustine was toying with the idea of establishing a curriculum for the steel pan. And in their eyes, the way to legitimize this instrument was to set it on par with other Western instruments. So we're going to have a series by or step by step, year by year curriculum for it, just like we would the violin and so on. And this again, reaches back to this colonial idea. But their way of, and I say there because this was done internally by folks down there, was to say this was what happened. Now, conversely, Northern Illinois University started a steel band program in 1974. 1973, roughly, they got the instruments. And the Northern Illinois University, along with several other hyphen schools, as we have seen throughout the country, in the 1970s, really started experimenting with the implementation of more diverse curriculums in their music programs. And so this is why um, it's not a mistake that Northern Colorado, Northern Illinois, and North Texas, the North withstanding, but that those hyphen schools have three of the finest jazz programs in the world, right? Um, and it's because these non-land grant universities were allowed a certain flexibility with their curriculums, and so in the 70s they really reached out to embrace jazz. Well, Northern Illinois also was embracing world music during this time. They had brought in an ethnomusicologist to do some Asian music and so on, but they had started the steel band program. And um, in 1985, the Al O'Connor, who was the professor of percussion at Northern Illinois University, he was able to engage the services of Cliff Alexis, who was a Trinidadian steel pan maker, tuner, arranger. And he was able to hire him to come to Northern Illinois University and be like, well, his position, he was a staff position, right? Like tuner, essentially. But he was able to get this guy to come to Northern Illinois University. And so what started to end up happening then is a lot of very fine steel pan players from the Caribbean, specifically Trinidad, started to come up to Northern Illinois University to do undergraduate and eventually graduate studies in music. And it was really like finishing school for a lot of these people because they had grown up in the steel band tradition. I mean, they were fine players, but they oftentimes played by ear, and they oftentimes, they didn't they understood jazz theory, harmony, all that kind of stuff. But I mean, if you said to them, I don't know, play me, a G9 13 or something, or play me a B flat sus chord or something like that, they just like didn't understand the sort of technical language of the training, and so Northern Illinois sort of filled in those gaps. Well, um, by the mid '90s, it became very clear that well, and they had set up a curriculum, and then they established that you could do a master's degree in steel pan performance, and um, they established this before UE, and this was seen as a real uh, like a real dark spot, a real embarrassment for the University of the West Indies, because the home of steel pan didn't even have this advanced training in steel pan, and that these Trinidadians had to leave Trinidad in order to like get the sort of I don't certification is I mean I don't know who gets to decide, right, but like that sort of academic certification that they were very 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 fine steel pan players, right. um and so this then spurred on UE to codify and set, and Dr. Joan Osborne was one of the people that set this forth, and the curriculum, and so on and so forth. But it's a really interesting kind of development, because it was like this American university that kind of spurred on the development of the Caribbean university. But what rather than sort of being like an us and them in a real black eye sort of situation, what UE started to do was say, okay, well, we're going to do the undergrad training, and then if people want to do graduate level training, then they'll go up to you in Northern Illinois. So they set a pipeline. And so I mean, ever since then, since 2000, the last 28 years, most of the graduate steel pan players, not all, of course, but a lot, 75% of them they do undergraduate at UE, and then they go to Northern Illinois and they get that graduate degree. And so there's this real connectivity now between the two institutions. And so it's been pretty interesting to see how that's developed.
No, I mean, it was really surprising to me to think about that. Like, sort of like the social dynamics involved in creating that program are pretty interesting because I see basically the Black Studies movement giving way to something like having a different aesthetic programs outside of European frameworks, like giving rise to like sort of different jazz studies movements and stuff. Like that's what the Black Studies movement did, and it was inspired in large part by the different African independence movements happening, like specifically like Ghana and these sorts of places and whatnot. But
Mhm.
here in this case, it's sort of like you have Black studies movement being inspired by these other places sort of thing, creating jazz programs and creating world music programs based on a form of kind of decolonizing the institution in some way. But that's not happening on the place where these different independence movements are taking place at the time. And I just think that's a really convoluted sort of dynamic at play.
Yeah, it really is. And I mean, it's interesting, and that decolonization movement it's a very real thing. I mean, you look at Trinidad became independent in 1962, and Antigua's 1981, and so I mean, you have like these things happening all along, but yet, yeah, it's almost like the reverse happens in the academy. One of the sort of major things that really, uh, well, two things really impacted um, Caribbean musicians coming to the United States in the second half of the 20th century. The first is in 1965, the U.S. changed the foreign quotas, the Taft-Hartley Act. They changed the foreign quotas immigration system that used to put restrictions on Caribbean immigrants. So it was put in place in 1918 to basically keep too many Irish and too many Europeans from just like flooding the United States, after the wars. And so, but it also included a lot of folks from the Caribbean. And they lifted that act because one of the things that they were noticing is that West Indians, which is that sort of generalized term for the Anglophone Caribbean, they had a really high propensity to enlist in the U.S. military, and they were very, very good soldiers, very disciplined, and blah 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 blah. And so, oftentimes coming from very educated families. And so, if you, for example, were like a fighter pilot, and you were Afro, we'll say Afro-Caribbean in this case, or Afro-American, but Afro-Caribbean American, however you want to look at that. There was a good chance that you came from a West Indian family during that time period. And so they lifted that. You had this huge flood of people immigrating to the United States during that time period, and a lot of them had these skills. But the second thing is that um, steel bands used to tour. And what would happen is they would tour the United States. They would leave Trinidad on with like a 3-month visa. And I mean, this is a one of the things, I guess, that the current immigration crackdown in the United States is kind of looking against, right? Where these people would come on a 3-month visa and they would tour and they would just be in these buses and they would play, this random county in Georgia's fair. And then they would go to, you know, all of the East Coast, West Coast and go around everywhere. And at the end of the 3 months, if 20 came to the US, like 15 would go home. 5 would just sort of stay and they would float off and they would just sort of, I like Grand Rapids, Michigan, kind of a thing. And they would just these random places. And I mean, this, and then they would do these things like in the 70s. I mean, these guys, I found newspaper clips and stuff of these, a bus of 18 Trinidadian dudes with afros showing up to like the South Dakota State Fair. I mean, they must have looked like aliens from outer space, playing steel pan nonetheless, right? And, and so, one of the things but who without technical credentials, like they don't have a K-12 teaching certification. They don't have any school certification at all, right? But yet they're highly trained in this instrument. And so they're ending up in Wichita, Kansas, or wherever it is, and they're a janitor at the local library or something, but then they're playing pans on the side, right? And so you had a lot of these kind of people throughout the Caribbean, starting playing little steel pan here or there. There's these random spots of this up in the Midwest, where I am in the Upper Midwest, and so there was a dispersal of this type of talent. Um, Whereas in the Caribbean, they were really seeking to bring in to bolster these university systems. They were really hoping to have local folks trained in that sort of white Western European tradition so that they could come back with the credentials. And after a couple of generations of that, they started realizing like, well, wait a second. We're getting further away from the sort of traditional methods, right? And so there is that sort of strange conflict. And then it comes to a head in the mid 1990s where they're like, wait a second, this university in the US all of a sudden has this band and we don't. And wait, and you could do a degree at Northern Illinois and you can't at the UWI. And so, yeah, it's a very interesting pathway to get there. And it's that sort of decolonization in reverse almost.
Yeah, no, for sure. It has elements of basically Pan-Africanist solidarity, but it also like kind of messes with the idea of sovereignty because you have to go to another place to learn something you should be learning at home. So that's why it's so interesting. It's both kind of like, hey, look, Black Atlantic solidarities through music, and also like, well, does this mess with questions of sovereignty during a period of decolonization as well?
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
it
Yeah.
gets super interesting, kind of like in the weeds stuff to think through. Now, I was also kind of curious. About these different pedagogical models you discuss in this piece, and you also offer 2 photographic examples, and it basically looks like, it's a lead sheet, pictures basically more or less from like a real book looking sort of thing. If you wouldn't mind talking about sort of, both you talk about Caribbean methodologies of learning and teaching, and also different Caribbean musics too, because I feel like there's different methodologies for learning different types of music and stuff like this, right? And also what the curriculum might consist of and look like, and some of the arguments also surrounding it.
Sure. So, um, what I find interesting and particularly compelling about Caribbean teaching methodologies, and I will just momentarily back away and say there are a lot of peoples from a lot of cultures throughout the world that have a lot of very interesting teaching methodologies, and so this is one that I find particularly interesting and compelling. It is certainly not the be all end all, and there are many people that would maybe chime in from other places and that would say something, "Oh, we do it that way too," kind of a thing. But one of the things that I find very interesting is that Caribbean music, traditional musics in Caribbean, and I'm not going to like limit, but for the sake of this argument, I'm going to say steel pan, soca, calypso, mento, these types of styles. Um, they are balancing a African rhythmic tradition and sensibility with a Western European harmony tradition and sensibility. And oftentimes when we are looking at traditional musics, and when I say traditional music for this argument, I'm just going to say not Western European art musics. Okay. When we were looking at these musics, we're often seeing things with very complex rhythm systems. We are seeing things with very complex melodic systems, and we're seeing things with both of those. So my friends who study Indian classical music will be like, you all think that you've got complex rhythmic, systems. Let's talk about the tal, and let's talk about microtones for our, and let's say, well, it's 2 in the afternoon. It's time for the raga, I mean, so I'm saying all of this, with the understanding there are some traditions that, you know, are very different. But um, in my piece, I am talking about one of the primary issues with teaching in the academy, which is that Western music notation does a poor job dealing with variations in harmony and rhythm. And the way that rhythm feels and the way that you write it down are mutually exclusive. They do not work the same. And anybody who's ever tried or looked at how we technically write jazz swing patterns, for example, um, will know that you notate it as a dotted eighth sixteenth. Do you notate it as a triplet, a triplet missing its middle triplet, so that you get the swung feel? Like, how are you going to notate this, right? Likewise, how do you notate to somebody that this saxophone trio is going to play a chord with, maybe root third and seventh, except for you're going to have to, like, that seventh or that third is going to have to be lowered down so that the harmony fits better because of, the naturally occurring natures of the harmonic system, right? And you can't notate that. You just, you say things like, well, this is why this saxophone quartet, or this is why the Guarneri quartet is so good, because after 50 years, these guys know how to adjust all of these harmonies to make them, really rich and sonorous, right? So we struggle in the Western system for this notation. But one of the biggest boundaries to learning musics, whether it boundaries, barriers, however you want to call it, one of the biggest barriers to learning new musics, certainly in the Western sense, is this idea of, well, I don't know how to read music, right? And so what we see in Caribbean methodologies is various approaches. And traditionally, calypso music and steel pan music are taught by rote, straight up by rote. Okay. And it's, I'm going to sing you this. I'm going to, you just repeat it back. And each one, there's this phrase, each one, teach one. So, I'm going to teach a group of people this song. So I'm going to teach one person one part, and then they're going to teach another person, and so on, right? You sort of, you spread the idea out. That in itself is certainly not unique to Black music or Caribbean music or whatever. But this is the idea of the oral tradition. But when teaching something that is completely notatable for the most part, we see some different interesting, I guess, creative ways to do it. And firstly, I will point out that the teaching process for traditional steel bands is very slow. As in, it just takes a long time, because if you have to teach every note and every part, and people, it's not that they are uneducated. It's just that they don't know where you're going next, because there's nothing to listen to and there's nothing to see for them to know what's going to happen next. Not that they couldn't just figure that out on their own. So there's always this idea of waiting, and this is where liming comes in, by the way, where you are going to wait to get whatever the arranger is going to tell you to do next, okay, or your teacher, whoever that is. So it's a slow process, and the learning that happens is very visceral, it's very corporal, and it's very solid. But over time, you forget things, you lose things change ever so slightly. Person's memory is a person's memory. It just is what it is. And if you ask some of these pan players, hey, do you remember this piece that you played 20 years ago? They're not going to remember every note, or they might not remember any of it. Whereas if you just lay down that Beethoven sonata in front of a concert pianist, even if they don't, they're like, yeah, I haven't played this in forever, but they'll just start playing because they just read the notes, right? And I'm not saying I'm not privileging one of these over the other. I'm just pointing out the difference between these things. The capacity for that pan player to play this piece is still absolutely there. They just don't remember it, okay? In neural pathways and so on. And so, what we start seeing then is ways in order to speed up the learning process. So, for example, a lot of the harmony parts in steel pan are based off of guitar strumming patterns, and more specifically, cuatro, the Venezuelan cuatro, which is a guitar variant. And the strumming patterns are taken from Venezuelan plains guitar strumming patterns as well. That's the first place. And the second place, rhythmically, that they get them from is Southeast Indian music. So Carnatic, Hindustani, well, that's northern, but like Southern Indian music, because Trinidad and Tobago has a significant portion of indentured Indians that came at the latter half of the 19th century, in the early part of the 20th century. And so we have rhythms that come from both those places. And so we see that then, though, merged with a propensity for language in the African tradition. And music, song games, lyric games, poems, stories, things taught with words so that they are easy to remember. And what I find particularly fascinating is, and is rather than saying, read this jazz pattern, it goes ding ding a ling ding 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 ding. They're going to teach you a word that's going to go along with that, right? Like like spangle or angle or whatever. Or one of my favorite ones was uh the rhythmic pattern is like and four and four, one and four, one and four. It's on the and of two and of three and four, right? And four. Okay. And they would say, I'm Lutheran. I'm Lutheran. I'm Lutheran. I'm Lutheran was this one. And it was because it was a church steel band. And so, and they were teaching like 5-year-old kids that, rather than saying, okay, well, this is how it goes, bop, bop, ba where it's some sort of indiscernible, not indiscernible, but like imprecise vocable versus like, here's an actual word phrase that I want you to use to learn this. And so they often will resort to word phrases to teach. And so again, they're not the only culture that's ever done this, right? We see this all the time, but it's particularly useful in this case. Oftentimes they'll teach in the church steel bands, they'll teach rhythm parts using like psalms and stuff like that. It's really quite amazing to see people do it. I'm endlessly impressed by some of these really creative teachers. And then you pair that up with another way, which I show in the piece, which is grid notation. And so they're saying, well, this thing rhythmically is based on what we call in music, a 4/4 pattern. It's going to be, 4 groups of 4. So I just make a grid of 16 and you hit here and you hit here and here, and you can just technically kind of see it all gridded out. And then this one is going to be a G, this one is going to be an F. And so then they are able to teach that way. And we look at this notation. I've heard in the jazz sensibility, people refer to these things as scratch notation before. I don't know if that resonates with any of your listeners, but just people just making up their own notation, right? And they make up, and it's also notation not based on Western notation symbols or anything. So they're not using repeat signs. They're making their own repeat signs. They're not using like, well, this is going to be a quarter note or a shorthand or whatever. Or since they're British, they like to say quavers and semi-quavers and all that kind of stuff. I should say British. They are formerly British. They are in the British system of education. Sorry, that could have gotten me in trouble there. Um, but the so you see people looking and saying Western notation isn't adequately doing what I want it to do, or it's just too much for people to learn. So on a shorthand, this is what I want to do. Now it works, of course, because music is based off of numbers. Well, certainly Western and African based music. Um, and then they equally adjust all of these other things, right? Like the feel of the rhythm, like, oh, you're not, I want you to be on the back side of that one, or, or the interlock's got to be here. And so I need you to be, connecting with this other part from over here and so on. Um, the steel pan, though, is a idiophone. So you strike it and it makes a sound. It's a solid piece of whatever. And so tone wise, on a steel pan, you don't have the tonal, uh, variations up and down that you would have in other instruments, right? This isn't a trumpet where you got to kick out that D slide every time because that D is going to be sharp, right? Like this isn't that. So you don't have to worry about those notes. You can you know, just write D, right? And if you wanted a high D or a low D, maybe you put an underline or on or a tilde on top or something, right, to show that you want the high one or the low one or whatever it may be. And so you are working about it working about it that way. Conversely, though, when teaching something like calypso music, now you are working into, and again, calypso, mento, bena, ska, reggae, these any Caribbean music, vocal music style that is utilizing local language, patois, Creole, however you want to call it. I mean, patois, sometimes people refer to patois when it involves French. Sometimes people say, um, Creole when it doesn't involve French and it just involves other local languages. But we're all talking about kind of the same thing here. We're talking about localized versions of lexicon and language, right? So when we are involving those things, now we're seeing that variation and we're using words to situate our melodies up and down. We're using words to situate some where those rhythms are fitting. And so part of the thing that I was arguing with the notation examples is that instead of looking to a Western notation that isn't really doing what you want to do in the first place, why not only empower people, or I should say embrace, but empower people to create these other systems that are going to fire off even more creative impulses and are frankly going to work better for these ensembles. And then, I mean, I've seen some of these gigging bands that work at hotels that have 3 and 4 hour repertoires. I'm talking like hours of music. And they go one after the other. And they just have little scratch notation cards. And they're like, oh, I don't remember Earth, Wind, and Fire September. And they just pull it up. Okay, I'm good. And then they're just, and because they've created their own notational systems to work out with that. And I mean, they're a lot similar, but still, it's an interesting, I think, it's an opportunity to embrace these pedagogies in a way. And I think more so than anything, people don't feel inadequate about this. As in like, I really should know how to do proper music notation, but like they are embracing this idea that the notation is going to be a visual representation of a ephemeral, or I guess in this place, an abstract concept, right? And I think they are they're thinking about that, I think, in a way that I find very refreshing.
Yeah, no, that's great. I mean, and usually it's also more of a pneumatic device than the art itself, sort of thing. Like this is a very classical division in so far as it's like what is considered the work. Is the composition that's written the work, or is the performance of it the work? And where does one start and where does one end? But this is about the sort of materialization of it. And there's also something economic about being able to sort of like write in your own manner and have 4 hours of material that can everyone can understand. Like this seems very sort of practical in a lot of different ways. And it's also what a lot of avant-garde composers were doing in the 20th century and anyway. They were like rendering things graphically in new ways to express express other forms of creativity and things. And when you create a new instrument, it's not going to generally fall neatly and whatnot. Like when you think of like prepared piano or something, like where do you put the note for like the scissors on top of the string or something like this, like
Right. Right.
in the grid, in the notation system. So obviously new forms of musical technologies and whatnot call for new forms of graphic notation as well. And also graphic notation just offers new ways of kind of rendering old things in creative new ways as well. Yeah, so it never kind of has to be rigid. I think that's great. Um, One thing that was really interesting to me was that these different bands that you described, these different steel pan bands, develop kind of differently and have different repertoire based on kind of their relationship with the university or with the community as well.
Hmm.
So if like one band goes here and then doesn't travel back to another place or whatever, they stick with like the local traditions and the music develops differently. Would you mind talking a little bit about the different steel pan bands that are near or adjacent to some of these universities?
Sure. So, really, and we're talking about UWI St. Augustine, and we're talking about UWI Mona. And the first one that I'll point out is the UWI band that is in Mona. And what is interesting about UWI Mona, and this is in Jamaica, is that it's really the premier steel band in the entire country. Because Jamaica does not have the same steel band tradition as some of the other islands. And so primarily in Jamaica, you have UWI, which is a very legit 50, 60 person steel band. And then everything else is going to be in churches and schools. And then there are some small ensembles that play the resorts and some solo steel pan players that play the resorts and things. But what is particularly fascinating about the Panariddim, which is the name of the band that is in UWI Mona, is that if there is a local group, whether that is a school or a church or what have you, that is interested in starting a new steel band, they will reach out to Panariddim and say, "Hey, can you help us?" And what generally happens, and this isn't something, of course, that's happening like weekly or monthly or even yearly, but it happens, every year or so, or every other year or something like that. So the frequency is, it is what it is. But um, is this group will reach out and they'll say, okay, well, we want to start a band. And so the Panaridim's going to ask questions. Okay, is this a church band? Is this a school band? And so let's say it's a church steel band. Churches like in the Caribbean like to use steel bands because they are a really great way to mix intergenerational playing and activity, right? So you can get youth playing, you can get adults playing, you can get adults playing with youth, and it's cool. It's still seen as something that's pretty cool for everybody to do. So it's not like, oh man, I don't want to play in steel band because Ethel is in steel band or whatever, right? Like my grandma or my auntie or whoever, right? It's like a intergenerational thing. So so then Pandorinium's going to ask questions. Okay, this is a church band. Okay, what's your denomination? Okay, well, uh, are you going to be in the Anglican church? Is this a Catholic church? Is this a Seventh Day Adventist church? Right, and so they will help them tailor learning and repertoire to be sensitive to those ecclesiastic traditions and the dogmatic traditions of whichever denomination that they're going into. If it's a school, is it a school? Is it a primary school? Is it a secondary school? Is this school one that's affiliated with the church or not? Right? I mean, there are there are parochial schools, academies in the Caribbean that still to this day are not okay with those kids playing soca music. Okay. Like that, or some of the, dubstep and some of the harder reggae and whatever. Like, no, you're not playing that. We know that's not appropriate, for church or whatever. So so the UWI band will help them figure out that context and then get them started on their way towards that. And what I've noticed is that the bands that have been helped in this way stick around. They have a very good base and longevity. It's like they're getting that training. It's like they're getting teacher training, but it's been delivered by the steel band. And it's not like in a formal way. There isn't like some sort of paperwork or, partnership that is signed. This is just this thing that happens. People donate their time. In UWI St. Augustine, you see um bit of a different process because a lot of the students that are, well, first of all, Trinidad's steel band scene is enormous. I mean, you're hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of steel bands. The largest steel bands, have hundreds of players, and I mean, there's just you have steel bands that have been around since the 1950s and 40s and stuff like that that have have these very long traditions, these 80 plus year or whatever traditions, and so these are the big mega steel bands, what I would call legacy steel bands that I've written about before. I would think of them as professional sports teams, but like old school professional sports teams, like the New York Knicks or like the Chicago Bears, or in hockey, the Montreal Canadiens, like ones that have been around forever, right? Like with tradition, you'd think about them like that. Um, but these bands are constantly looking for youth development. They are constantly looking to bolster their ranks and to work on community building. And so what UE helps them do is send some of their promising youth to UE who then are playing, because UE St. Augustine has a band as well. They're learning new arranging techniques. Because at UE St. Augustine, if you are a steel pan major there, you don't study jazz arranging. You study steel pan arranging. Like instead of one of your music history, instead of 20th century music history, you do pan history. Like there's like formalized courses for your instrument that makes sense. So it's a great training opportunity for a lot of these students. And so then these people are able to come back and be working now with some of these major bands in the areas throughout Trinidad to just really continuously develop musicality and I guess band development, whether it be techniques and arranging and all that kind of stuff. And so there's a real connectivity there. What I was arguing in the one article I wrote was that Antigua's Five Islands campus now for UE could really benefit from that Mona version that I first described, which is that there's more opportunity for community building and training there than there is in other places, because the scene is not as enormous as it is in Trinidad.
No, that makes a lot of sense. It's funny, a lot of there's so many continuing aspects of it. Like, one reason was to bring in and to expand the university. Was one of the goals of Black Studies and whatnot, was kind of bridging this community divide, specifically because a lot of the surrounding areas of the university are like gentrified, or the university does these various sort of damages to these communities and creates further alienation. So the university was trying to bring in all of these other aspects, and music is obviously such a great way. And it's also forms basically like a mental health or health program in different ways. That's kind of
Well, there is this confluence of formal versus informal education, right? And that Black Studies ethos, or I guess one of the the driving forces early on, was to embrace these sort of like non-formal, informal traditions and learnings and opportunities. And I think that's one of the real key elements of looking at all of these different musics is, um, a lot of the early history of jazz is people hanging out, playing music together, and I mean, and this is again why, like, one of the one of the biggest like existential crises of the music academy is looking at old time or early jazz with collective improvisation. Because it's like, okay, well, we're okay with one person taking a solo here from this chorus to this chorus, but now if everybody's just sort of like doing stuff at the same time, like how do we deal with that, right? And it's looking at it's embracing those informal moments as equally as important in the educational process as the quote formalized moments. I mean, I think that's what, when we talk about decolonizing the institution, and I think that's in the US, certainly 2026, we're really up against that in the institutions where there's a lot of stress to cut down degree size. There's a lot of stress to say, students come in and they take this class and then they leave. And the idea of hanging around afterwards and going to that office hour and engaging with your fellow students and creating a study group and like, again, that informal learning that happens outside of that formalized classroom is really under attack, especially with, the continued efforts to minimize or to at least undo some of the liberal arts curriculums, right? Is really sort of going against this ethos of formalized and informalized study.
Yeah, for sure. We gotta bring back or, incorporate liming into all of these aspects, very much so.
Sure.
And yeah, the individual solo versus the collective thing also speaks to kind of like the collective individual sort of things going on. How does a university that's mostly focused on the unit of the individual think of the collective, right? That brings about a certain kind of manic response in some way to tepid that. Um, there was a few things. Kind of questions and what. So I was kind of curious. Now, there's a lot of alumni that come out of these programs doing different things, right? Working in institutions, but also notable alumni that are also kind of like creating the sound of Pan African kind of unity in different ways. Like, there's the summer song that happens like once a year. There's this big summer song that everybody kind of like knows or something. Like, and everyone sings it and it like kind of brings everyone together in that time and place and then later evokes that memory. Would you mind talking about some of the alumni that came out of these programs or worked within?
Sure. So there are a lot of alumni, and they are spread throughout the world. But now, um, the people such as Dr. Mia Gormandy, who is the professor leader of the Steel Pan Studies program at the University of Trinidad and Tobago. She is a graduate of both UWI and of Northern Illinois University. Um, and as well as Dr. Janine Remy just retired from UWI, but she was one of the leaders in the UWI Steel Pan program, but she was also a Northern Illinois as well as a UWI alum. But if you are going to start looking out at universities throughout the Caribbean, you are going to see the impact of this. And so, um, several of the professor lecturers is what they're known in the UWI system. Several of the lecturers at UWI Five Islands are graduates of these programs, like Dr. Zara Lake and Concordis, who's the director. Um, he's the minister of culture for Antigua Barbuda. These are all Northern Illinois grads. There's a person in university professor in South North Carolina, Greensboro, Dr. David Aarons. And so we're seeing many of these alumni are all throughout those areas. Currently, and I should say currently because he's been there for a while and will be there for a while. Liam Teague is the professor of steel pan studies and the leader of the Northern Illinois University program. And Liam is a graduate of Northern Illinois University. He's a Trinidadian who went through the program. He's also one of, the sort of top three soloing steel pan virtuosos in the world, plays with a lot of orchestras and jazz bands and things like that, doing a lot of steel pan concertos and things like that throughout the world. There are graduates in Japan. There are people in couple of Europe. One of the in Taiwan, at Taiwan National University, I think something like that, is a Northern Illinois graduate who runs a music program there. And so we're over the last 20 years, you're seeing these people work in a lot of universities, but in Trinidad and in Antigua, in these places with big steel pan scenes, you are seeing a number of people who are now arrangers or band leaders who have had this training from Northern Illinois and or the UWI St. Augustine program. And so it's also the success of these graduates is such now that this is seen as like a standard. It's a brand, just as like people aren't going to question the pedigree of somebody who goes to Stanford or something to that account. People are going, oh well, you're a Northern Illinois person, okay, that makes sense. Or you're a UWI St. Augustine grad. So we're seeing these grads doing a variety of different things in the music world, mind you, not just like they're not just going and then going back and working at a bottle factory or something. And not that that's a terrible thing. I'm just saying, like, these are people who are now going into schools, they're going into university programs. Um, One of the things that is particularly compelling in the United States is that um, there are several K-12 schools that have steel pan, full-time steel pan directors. So there are several in Charleston, South Carolina. There are some in Florida, and a couple of places in California and in various other elements. There's a Horseman School, which is in New York, um, and uh, Obi Corliss runs the one in Horace Mann. And so there are Northern Illinois graduates that are doing, they're like a K-12 school teacher, but they do only steel pan. And a lot of them are graduates of the Northern Illinois University program. There's several of them in that Florida area as well, South Carolina too. So we're seeing um, these people come from the Caribbean, and they're getting meaningful work in educational institutions in the United States, as well as those who want to go back to the Caribbean. And the real question going forward is do people want to return to the Caribbean? Is there work for them in the Caribbean? Or is this just like another way to like step on up and out of that Caribbean basin and into a job in the United States? And I'm not saying it is, that this is like an issue or a problem, but it is an interesting sort of um, thought process to say that like, are all the people returning? There seems to be an equal number of people returning back to the Caribbean versus people staying up in the U.S. So it's not just a straight brain drain.
Yeah, of course. I mean, it's very differently it's cyclical. There's a lot of different writings, like on Saint Kitts doing the same sort of stuff, like what it means for musicians to come back, and then kind of like the size of the island impacting who's there and who leaves and all this really interesting stuff. So the Caribbean is never kind of a one-way flow, right? Um,
Yeah,
in
absolutely,
in
absolutely.
any
Well,
straightforward way.
right, and in part of it too is what does meaningful work look like to somebody, right? I mean, a K-12 teaching position in the US is a very good job, right? It's going to pay very well. And a K-12 teaching position in a place like Antigua, for example, is a good job, but it's going to pay probably about one third of the US position, right? And it's going to have equally prestigious and everything in terms of all that, but it's just, um, I think sometimes people are looking to say, well, if I could make that much more in Florida, it's going to make my dollars go more, and I've got family, and this kind of stuff. So, these are those choices. But you're right, and some people do it for a few years and then return, and it's definitely cyclical. It's not a one way thing. That's for sure.
Well, yeah, of course. So, yeah, before we end our conversation, is there anything else you want to say or talk about or touch on?
Um, the I guess the last thing I'll say is, I think that sometimes in the academy, when we are studying a music, that we like to look at it as a encapsulated. It's like a moment in time, right? And uh, even something like a recording is a moment in time, yes, but these are parts of larger and breathing and moving traditions. And so sometimes there is that propensity to study a non-Western music and to look at it as a museum piece, and rather than something that is a moving, living, breathing, changing tradition. And so part of what always keeps me coming back and endlessly interested in studying Caribbean music is this idea that it's different. Things are different now than from when I first started. And I think that's great. And that these are developing moving traditions. And so I just want to uh, keep being a part of that. I think you might be muted.
Okay. Sorry about that. Rookie mistake.
Yeah.
I wasn't sure if the mic cut out at all on your.
Oh, okay. Uh, well, I was long-winded going on. Just my appreciation for the living and breathing tradition of this music, and that it's not static, and that it is something that is changing, and it's reinventing itself, and that the when we're talking about any music that's popular, it's not a question of selling out, and that people get to determine what is happening next. And when I was in Jamaica just recently, I was into some very local places, not tourist places, and they were listening to Bob Dylan just like people at the resorts listen to Bob Dylan. Sorry, Bob Dylan, Bob Marley, just like people at the resorts listen to Bob Marley. And so I'm interested in this study long term and just seeing how things change over time. And I think that there's definitely room for that.
Yeah, that's great. And of course, there's so many different modalities of listening. Like two people could approach Bob Marley very, very differently. Like he speaks to different parts of them. One like scratches the tourist brain of like, I'm in this fun drinking spot. The other one is like, we need a new world or something like this. Like
Yeah. And they're
yeah.
both, we can hold them both.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, and one thing I'm just interested in is what does it mean to have a music in a community sort of music, like a collectivized kind of like music happening in the community in one place, and then to bring it into this institution. So I'm kind of always thinking about these things and how they relate and move and change. So I really appreciated reading your article.
Yeah, yeah, great. Well, I'm very thankful for this talk, and I'll always love seeing people engage with the music because I think it's a beautiful tradition, and um, I want people to look beyond the resorts and look at the people because there's amazing stuff happening in the Caribbean every day.
Great. Well, thank you so much. It was a pleasure.
Pleasure's all mine.